these lands. There is a white stork that walks through the sand, and whether you come from this land or theirs, you'll find a portal under your stairs. Tricksters, outlaws, fairies and thieves, nothing is quite what you see. Tricksters and pirates, gypsies and crows, nothing is quite what you know. Oh, nothing is quite what you know.
Nothing is quite what you know. A good theme for this evening's stories from Celtic mythology. Because in Celtic mythology, everything is always slightly divorced from reality and nothing is quite what it seems. So, that little intro. Welcome everybody. Thank you for having us for this evening. Lovely building this, isn't it? I like this place. My name is Oliver Lavery. I'm a storyteller. This is Tamsin Quin.
Hello. Nice to meet you.
We've got a few traditional folk tales for you guys tonight. Thank you, Gary, as well at the back here, who had me here for a little storytelling show last year in Lancashire called Trickster Makes This World, which was sort of on the archetype of the trickster that exists across the world. You've got Coyote, you've got Raven, you've got the Norse god Loki, not the Marvel character. You've got the Native American Wolverine, again, not the Marvel character, that's different. The Greek Hermes, all these different tricksters. So for this show, we thought we would sort of home in on these islands, because we love tricksters in our folklore and our myth in this country. You know, we got Robin Hood, we've got Finn McCool, we've got Jack the Giant Slayer, we've got Peter Rabbit, Fantastic Mr. Fox, we've got Puck, we've got Robin Goodfellow the fairy. We're going to have more fairies tonight, aren't we, Tam?
Yes.
Very more local folkloric fare for you guys tonight. Also, I should say as well, the thing with storytelling, traditional storytelling in the oral tradition, is nothing's ever written down. That's there's no script to this, everything is coming off the cuff. The stories exist, they're thousands of years old in many cases, but all of this is sort of improvised and exists in the moment. So
apart from my songs.
Apart from Tam's songs,
I don't have a good memory for that.
She doesn't make them up on the spot. That would be pretty impressive. So all of this might fall out of my mouth in a jumbled way. So forgive me for that. But this is only our second show of this little tour. We were in Preston last night. We're in Blackpool tomorrow. So thank you all for being our guinea pigs. Celtic folklore. We've got three little stories for you guys tonight. We've got one from Wales, we've got one from England, quite local to here actually, and we've got one from Scotland, and that's probably all we've got time for tonight. We're not going to go on a little coracle ride to Ireland tonight. This first story is a very, very old story, very unique to these islands. There's only one other version of it that exists, and it's about the origin of things. It's got a cauldron in it, a sort of Celtic bowl, which is a very old Celtic symbol, which is probably where we get the idea of the Holy Grail from. And it's about the origin of a certain storyteller, so a good place to begin. The most famous and brilliant storyteller that you may never have heard of, unless you're Welsh. And this story is called The Cauldron of Ceridwen and the Birth of Taliesin.
Fill a cauldron of beauty, fill a cauldron of wisdom. Fill a cauldron of love with herbs from this land. And stoke up the fire for a year and a day. Hey, hey, oh. though by peasant hands.
Long ago, long ago, in deep time, in myth time, which is out of time, there was a witch, a white witch, if you like, a sorceress, and her name was Ceridwen. Now, Ceridwen, she lived in a hut in the woods in deepest, darkest Wales, and she lived there with her husband, whose name was Tegid the Bald, because he was, and with their 2 children. Now, one of them, she was lovely. She was beautiful, she was clear-eyed, she was sparkling like the sun, she was funny, she was intelligent, she was just, she was a joy to be around, you know? The other son, whose name was Vagdi, he wasn't. He was ugly, he was thick as mince, he was foul-tempered, he was just horrible. No trait was positive in him, and he would not do well in the world. He was ungainly, he had this big lolling head, these clumpy feet, he was like a seagull or a vulture. One of the reasons why sometimes they called him Morfan, the sea crow. He was an ugly bugger, right? Now, Ceridwen, she loved both her children, and she desperately wanted to do something for her dear, darling boy, to make him manage. Now, she couldn't make him beautiful, not even with all her power. She couldn't do that. She had no skill in sorcery to change his appearance into that of a handsome man, but she could make him wise and powerful, magically powerful, beyond the dreams of any mortal man, as powerful as Ceridwen herself. Now, to do this, there's a very special thing. She had to brew, as I'm sure many of you know, because I think many of you may have heard this story, she had to brew a potion. Now, this is a very particular thing, and only Ceridwen could make such a potion. It had to be brewing for a year and a day. That's quite a common theme in Celtic myth, a year and a day, and you had to put certain herbs in it, plucked under certain phases of the moon with certain planetary alignments, say certain incantations over it at the right time, and you had to have this cauldron just on a constant, nice, rolling simmer. It couldn't boil, and it could never go out, or the cauldron was ruined. Last thing you need to know about this cauldron and this potion, only the first 3 drops of the potion contained any magic whatsoever. In fact, all of the magic and power of knowledge and inspiration were contained in the first 3 drops of that potion. Once those first 3 drops were consumed, the rest instantly turned to poison. Funny thing. So, Ceridwen set about making this potion, but she couldn't stir it and keep it bubbling all by herself, so she needed 2 slaves, and she had them. The first one was an old, blind slave whose name eludes me for the purposes of this story, but it was his job just to stir the potion. Just keep stirring it. He had a nice long spoon. Incidentally, Tam's a spoon carver. She's got some lovely spoons on sale at the back after the show if you're interested. So he had to stir the cauldron. And she had another little slave, a little peasant boy, plucked from a nearby village in the deepest, darkest wood. And his name was Gwion Bach. And he just had to keep the fire lit under the cauldron, go out into the woods, collect kindling, and just keep that fire just nicely lit so the cauldron was just simmering away. Now this went on. She had her 2 slaves. She would go out into the woods, collect her herbs, you know, eye of newt, wing of badger, hair of Boris Johnson, whatever it is. Goes into the cauldron, and Gwion has to keep it going. 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months. This is a very critical time for the potion. She has to be out gathering a lot of herbs now. There's 1 day left, and then the potion will be ready to give to her son, Avagdi, right? So, she goes out into the woods. She gives Gwion strict instructions. Do not let that fire go out, little Gwion. And do not let the fire get too high, or I will cut off your thumbs and ears and your nose. Right, so off she goes. Gwion is quite petrified, and he's keeping the fire going, But what happens? That other slave, whose job it is to stir, he, getting pretty old, he just falls asleep, and nothing Gwion can wake him. So now Gwion's got two jobs, right? He has to go out and get the kindling, but he also has to stir the bloody cauldron, all right? So what he does, he gets a little bit too much more kindling than he thinks is wise, and just stokes it up and stirs, and then goes out and gets some more kindling and comes back and stirs, but the cauldron is boiling too much, and a great big bubble boils to the top of the surface of that potion, and bloop. 3 boiling drops sail out of the top of that cauldron and just land on Gwion's stirring hand, and instinctively he puts his thumb in his mouth to ease the pain, and instantly his little mind is blown wide open like barn doors, right? All knowledge of past and future events just pour into his mind. It's way too much information for such a tiny little mind. He's spent his whole life, mind, within the same mile radius of the hut where he was born and Ceridwen's hut. He knows nothing of the outside world, and suddenly he's seeing whole civilizations rise and fall. He's seeing dinosaurs roam across the planet Earth. He's seeing the cosmic void. He's seeing the vast expanse of stars and the universe stretching out to the world. He's seeing all his own past lives stretching back and back and back and back and back into infinity, when he was dark animals moving through the shadows and little worms moving through the ground, beings moving through infinite white light. He could see all of this, and it was too much to comprehend, and he could see the thoughts of everything. He could see into the future. He could see the future of mankind. He could see Blackpool Tower being built in the industrial age. He could see the complete works of Joni Mitchell, all of Blue, and all the weird jazz shit that we don't like to talk about. He could see everything. And he could see the thoughts and minds of all the trees and all the spirits. He could see the dreams of that blind slave that were probably mainly to do with stirring, just going on, blip, 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 blip. He could see the minds of all the animals. He could see through the walls of that hut, and he could see far, far through the tangled, dark forest where Ceridwen, his long-time captor, was sickling herbs in the moonlight. And he could see her mind too. And he could see that she meant him no good. He could see that she would kill him when the potion was done. And he could see that she could feel him too. And she turned and locked eyes with Gwion through the distance and time. And she made her way towards him like a maelstrom of malintent, and tore through the walls of that hut and arched high above it like a great arc of cat piss and crows, and was about to tear through Gwion Bark. And in that moment, Gwion Bark thought, if only I could become a hare. And in that moment, he transformed himself into a hare, and boom, through Ceridwen's legs and out into the dark, tangled forest, into safety. But Ceridwen had the power of transformation too. And if little Gwion Bark could become a little hare, then Ceridwen could become a hound. And become a hound she did, fast. And she transformed and chased after Gwion, that hare, that ancient chase of hare and hound, going over the roots and under and over barrows and hills, through the dark, moonlit forest. But Gwion, he could turn slightly quicker, and he was just making his escape with that hound snapping after, when before him was a river running quick and fast. A river running through the forest. It was, I don't know, the River Wye, let's say. I don't know why. No, thank you. And at that moment, Gwion thought, thinking his game was up, he thought, if only I could swim. And in that moment, he transformed into a salmon. plop into the river and swam away upstream. And Ceridwen, if Gwion Bark could become a salmon, then Ceridwen could become an otter. And she turned into an otter and leapt right after Gwion Bark into that river and swam fast, fast, fast after him. Anga, anga, anga. The little otter jaws closing after that little silver salmon tail. And then Gwion was swimming faster and faster upriver, and before him was a great waterfall. And he swam up that waterfall, and that otter came straight after. I didn't know otters could go up waterfalls, but in this story they can, all right? So they're going up. And Gwion reaches the very crest of that waterfall and erupts up into the sky, into the starlit sky, and at the very peak of his arc, he begins to come down, and that otter is coming straight up after. And he's falling down, and Gwion thinks, oh shit, if only I could fly. And in that moment, quick as thinking, transformed by his own thought, he turns into a sparrow. Swift, spiraling up into the shifting skies. But if Gwion Bark could become a sparrow, then Ceridwen could become a sparrowhawk instantly. Broad wing, up, wheeling on wings of death after Gwion Bark, the little sparrow. And they go into a dogfight, wheeling through the sky. That sparrow, again, can turn quick on the wing, but his little heart was running out of beats, and Ceridwen, the sparrowhawk, had more stamina, flapping those raptor jaws, getting ever closer. Dawn is breaking now, and there, over the forest, Gwion Bark sees a clearing in the great oak forest and a little settlement, a few round houses, silver curls of smoke reaching up into the dawn, and there a great barn. This was Gwion's salvation. He arced down, spiraling down towards that barn, towards one of the little slats, one of the little ventilation slats in that wooden barn, and just turns himself in the air, into the dark. There, inside that barn, it was harvest time, and there were mounds and mounds and mounds of grain after threshing. And Gwion Bark, in midair, turns himself into a single grain of wheat and plops among 1,000 other grains. Ceridwen, for her part, she couldn't fit through that little gap, so she just lands on the floor and brings herself back into her true human form, opens the barn doors and spies with her black eyes all these piles of grain, and she goes, ah, gotcha. And she turns herself into a black hen and begins to eat the grains, one after the other, after the other, after the other, pecking the grains, pecking the grains. She didn't know which grain Gwion Bark was, but she knew he was one of them. Pecking, eating the grains up, eating the grains, eating the grains, eating the grains. It's a magic hen. She can eat as many grains as she wants, all right? Eating the grains, eating the grains, eating the grains. Till there's just one grain left. Ah, there you are, little Gwion Bark. And she ate him up. Turned herself back into her human form, placed her hand on her belly and smiled a self-satisfied smile, knowing she had eaten that little shit alive. Oh, bugger, she thought. She knew, like all women know. A little spark in the fertile crescent between her hips had suddenly flared into life, and she knew, that's right, she was up the duff. And she would have to wait 9 bloody months to kill him! Oh, but she was very good at biding her time. I do tend to spit on the front row, I'm sorry about that. She was very good at biding her time, and she would sit rubbing her very sweaty, maybe I'm just projecting here, very sweaty palms by the fire, thinking of all the ways she would slay him. Would she snip off his limbs with a pair of scissors? Would she feed him to the dogs? Would she just eat him alive again? Would she throw him into the fire, bury him in the ground? But when that day came, she did not have the heart to do it. He had the most beautiful eyes. I mean, what mother could? The most beautiful, shining eyes, like dawn was bursting out of the middle of his head. So she did this instead. She swaddled him up and put him in a little basket, a bit like Moses, and carried him to the river, the same river that she once chased him through all those moons ago, and placed him on that river and let the current carry him away. Down river, down river, down river, out of myth time and into history. Hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, out of the dreaming into now. And that little baby floated out into the sea, into the Bay of Cardigan, where the King of Aberystwyth reigned, and he had a very lazy son that liked to spend all his time fishing and spend no time doing anything else that princes are supposed to do. So one day, the Prince of Aberystwyth was fishing, and he cast out his net, and, oh, I've got a bloody big fish. I'm sorry for my Welsh accent, it's terrible. I've got a bloody big fish, he thought, and he drew in this baby in a basket, and he uncovered the swaddling that it was in, and it had the most beautiful shining eyes, like a third eye right here. And he thought, my father will be pleased with this. Finally, I've done something. And he carried that baby back to his father's castle. And a funny thing happened, you know, in that short journey back to shore, the child sort of grew to about yay big. I don't know, this kind of age. It's like, what, I don't know, was that? Depends on your height, really. This big, this big. And that little boy, fully dressed now, don't know where he got his clothes from, but he was now wearing clothes. He strode directly into the court and addressed the King of Aberystwyth, who had said to his son, "What have you brought home from fishing, son?" And the boy answered himself in pure and perfect Welsh, "My name is Taliesin of the Shining Brow, and I will be your storyteller."
Fill a cauldron of beauty, fill a cauldron of wisdom. Fill a cauldron of love with herbs from this land. And stoke up the fire for a year and a day. Hey, hey, oh, made for my son. I change, we end up in the grain, and I'll see you again in 9 months to the day. And I come, you change, I change, we end up in the grain, I'll see you again in 9 months to the day. Sail my beautiful boy away, oh Taliesin. Don't take my stories to the grave. Sail my beautiful boy away, sail my beautiful boy away, oh Taliesin. Don't take my stories to the grave.
Don't take my stories to the grave. It's a fitting phrase for any storyteller, I think. One of the reasons that we both love folklore is the age of some of these stories. You know, they're just passed on like currency of the tongue, successive generations. There's some Celtic stories, ancient Celtic stories that have resonances in ancient Greece and ancient India, you know, a shared sort of Indo-European ancestry. So these stories that are so bloody old, sometimes it's like stepping back into the mindset of our ancestors, I think, which is just fascinating for a myth nerd like me.
Do you have any other myth nerds in the house?
Oh yeah.
Oh, good. You're not alone tonight, Dave.
But yeah, that story that you just heard, there's only one other version of that in the world, and that's from Ireland, which is a bit more comic. Instead of a cauldron of knowledge, it's a hazelnut that knows everything, and it's unfortunately eaten by a salmon that then becomes the salmon of knowledge. You might have heard of this, until it's fished out of the river by a certain druid and his apprentice Finn McCool, who I'm sure you've all heard of, who is then cooking that salmon, and then again, same image. Knows everything. It's got sort of that sort of Irish comic charm to it, because in order to access the knowledge, it's not like Taliesin, he's just got it, he has to bite the end of his thumb off each time, which probably means a visit to the A&E each time. So yeah, it's a little bit different. But this next story is also a very, very local one. There's 3 versions that I know of, and they're all from Britain. And when I was researching this part of the world, 'cause sometimes it's nice to do a story from the local area where you're storytelling. I came across this story that some of you might have heard of, and I was amazed because it's in almost exactly the same version where we're from in the West Country, and then there's another version, probably the original, I guess, in Wales as well. So that story has just travelled, it's just walked, carried by storytellers down into the West Country and over here as well. Maybe by someone like Taliesin, because he was a historical as well as a mythic figure sort of during the Roman occupation. That's why we know about him. He's sort of recorded in some of the Roman historic accounts. So he was the bard or storyteller to a number of Welsh kings in Aberystwyth, and then in North Wales, and then to some Cumbrian British kings as well. So Taliesin may have passed through this area, we don't know. In fact, he could have passed through Spinner's Mill, who knows.
What did the landlord say to Taliesin?
I don't know what the landlord say to Taliesin.
Get out, you bard. Folklore joke.
We came up with that one in the car, we enjoyed it.
Yeah. Kind of giggling for about 10 minutes of our long journey.
Yeah, so this is a story about fairies.
Good, I like fairies.
Yeah, well, you like sort of the Disney fairies.
No, I like Peter Pan and nice fairies.
But you don't like these fairies. These are original Celtic fairies, and they're horrible. All right.
Little buggers.
Yeah. So this is a story called the Midwife and the Fairy. Long ago, but not that long ago, there was a midwife, what you might call a cunning woman. A bit like maybe a slightly softer version of Ceridwen from the last story. But she also lived alone in a little house just on the edge of society. You know, she didn't like so many visitors, and people came to her for, well, both midwifery, but also for maybe herbal cures, or maybe to tell their fortune in the stars or in a cup of tea, that sort of thing. You know, a cunning woman. So she knew a thing or two about the other world. Now, one night, I should say, this midwife was just, she was just tucking herself into bed at night. She had just, finished her last mug of tea. She was just blowing on the last embers in the grate of her fire. And she had just taken a little candle up to bed, up the flickering, creaking stairwell of her humble little cottage. And she was just getting into bed when there was a knock at the door. You should have done that bit.
Yeah.
There was a knock at the door, and she suddenly sat bolt upright in bed and thought, oh, who the hell is this? And she relit the candle and hobbled again through the flickered shadows of her home. and opened the front door, and it was storming, mind. There was a great rainstorm, raindrops on the roof, rumble of thunder in the distance. Thank you. And she opened the door, and there, just beyond the threshold, was a dark figure on horseback. Now, you didn't need to be a cunning woman to know that there are a few strange things about this tall, dark, handsome stranger. For the first, his clothes were, I don't know, about 100 or 200 years out of date. He was wearing one of those, triangular hats and a long frock coat. No one wears that stuff anymore. And, slightly bigger clue, the raindrops were stopping about a foot above his head and fizzing into steam. You didn't need to be a cunning woman to know that this was an emissary from the other world. This was a fairy, or a Benji, as it's sometimes called in our part of the world. Now this man then spoke in a voice like water running over stones on a desolate moor, and he said, "I have gold for you. My wife is in labour and I need a midwife. That person is you." Now, I think we've all got an instinct about this kind of thing. If someone comes with an offer at midnight to your door, you go, no, not me. I don't know what you did in this last situation. But then he drew a bag of gold out of his pocket, and it glinted in the light, and that changed her mind. And he said, "There's another just as big when you've done the job." I don't know what possessed her, but she agreed. "One more thing," said this fairy rider. "You need to be blindfolded. I cannot show you where I live." And she agreed. So the blindfold went over her eyes, and she was hoisted on the back of that horse and away. Suddenly she felt the years fall off her. It was like she was a girl again, being taken to some secret place by suitors long hidden in the labyrinths of time and memory. She was riding out. The rain had stopped now. She could smell the moist earth, feel the wind. There was a roar of the river. When she just crossed the ribble, I don't know. She was off further into a desolate moors and hills and forests. She didn't know how long she was riding, but it felt like a long time. Again, she had dropped, perhaps out of time. Eventually, she'd arrived at the place, and the blindfold was taken off her, and she was lifted from that horse. It was not what she was expecting. It was a dingy, dark place, some pools on the floor, an open sky, no houses or lights for miles, a few stubs of candle for light, and a dark, dingy hole about the size of a badger set. In fact, maybe that's exactly what it was. And she was ushered to crawl in, first on her hands and knees, into this slimy hole. I'm sure we've all been there, not literally, of course. In she goes, maybe literally. In she goes, crawling down this tunnel, longer, into the dark, into the underworld, and then it opens out into the most fabulous underground chamber you can possibly imagine. Carved pillars, hung tapestries, the stuff of, I don't know, Sutton Hoo burial chamber, or an ancient Viking longship burial, like a dragon's hoard. Everything was in there. It was wondrous to behold, and lights hung in the air, great piles of gold and jewels covered the floor. It gave her a strange feeling. Maybe it was the incense hanging thick and heavy in the air. And there, in the corner, on a sort of red plush couch type thing made of pure gold, was the fairy rider's mistress in the pangs of labour. This is where instinct kicks in, right? She knew how to do this job, so she got right to it. However, there was one specific instruction that she had to follow. She was given this instruction by the fairy rider himself, and it was very important that she followed this exactly. She was given a little pot of balm, like an ointment, that she was to smear on the eyes of the fairy child once it was delivered. but she was under no circumstances to get any at all in her own eye. Whenever someone's given like an instruction like this in a folklore, you know damn sure what's going to happen, don't you? So she delivers the child, everything goes swimmingly, you know, she's done a very good job, and this beautiful, beautiful little fairy child is in her arms, and she does as instructed, you know. So the wife is out, the mistress is out for the count now, and she's just rubbing some on the eyeballs of this child, and then she just, we all do it, don't we? We've all done it. She just gives it a little rub in her eye, and then just the one eye, mind, just to see, and then opens that eye. Oh dear. She's not in an underground palace at all. She's in a dark, dingy cave infested with bats and rats and spiders dripping from stalactites and pools of mould and sick on the floor. And this thing in her arms isn't a beautiful boy at all. It's hideous! It's a this little horrible monster with black eyes and sharp teeth and 6 limbs and tentacles coming out of its belly button all over the place. It's hideous. It's a real fairy, monstrous thing. Well, she quickly, you know, closes that eye and opens the other one and makes her excuses and leaves. And as soon as she knows she's back on the back of that horse, being carried away by her fairy chaperone back across the moors and hills, until soon she's the other side of her little cottage door with another big heavy bag of gold in her hand. She puts it underneath her pillow in her bed, sits down by the fire, pours herself a very big glass of gin, drinks it, and tries to forget the whole thing. A few days later, she's sort of managed to expunge the whole event from her memory, but she's running out of some essential supplies, and it's market day in Preston. So she has to go and get some bits and bobs. So she's walking into town, feeling a bit queasy as she crosses, you know, one of those bridges that I forget the name of, into town. Medieval Preston this is, you know, she's going, or 18th century Preston, doesn't matter. Over she goes, and suddenly she stops, because a fish has leapt out of the stream, and for some reason it has a human face, and it slows down in time and just eyeballs her as it jumps over the bridge. And she stops and has to steady herself on the bridge, and she's putting her hands on the bridge, and as she removes her hand, the bridge is covered in eyes that are looking at her like this. And she removes the other hand, and her hands are shifting and moving. Sometimes the fingers are sticking together. Another eye appears on her forearm there and looks at her, and it jumps off her forearm and scuttles away down a mouse hole. She carries on walking through the market, but the entire market stall sellers they have the faces of crows or badgers. There are a horse with the face of a dog. There are pigeons with eyes on their backs, and rats with crows bursting out of their faces. There's all sorts of strange things, and she looks at all the vegetables, and they're all moving. The carrots are maggots, and everything is very, 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 very strange. She goes and sits in the back of the, I don't know, where were we last night? The Stanley Arms, and sits in the back and orders another very stiff gin. And drinks that, puts it down, but the beams are moving, and they have eyes all over them, and some of them are trying to whisper things in her ear. She goes out of that pub and decides it's probably time to go home. Forget market today, she thinks, and she's just on her way, trying to figure out, orientate herself, which is the right way to go, when she sees, at the other end of the marketplace, something she recognises. It's a figure dressed in black, riding the back of a horse, with a triangular hat. But he's not the dark, handsome stranger of before. His face is hideous and cowled, with dark hollows for eyes and sharp teeth, 2 slits for a nose. You know, he's like Voldemort, long, skinny fingers. And she sees him and makes eyes with him across the market. And a bit like Ceridwen and Gwion from the last story, he suddenly feels her looking at him and meets eyes with her. And then he heads forward on his horse, gently weaving through the market goers who are completely impervious to his existence, and trots up alongside to her slowly, grabs his reins, leans down in the saddle, and says, "Which one of your eyes can see me?" Trembling, she points to this one. And he plucks it out of her skull and drops it on the market floor, and his horse squashes it. Pop. She drops like a sack of potatoes, screaming, blood spurting out of her face. to all the assaulted villagers, they don't know what's happened. You know, they just see this blood squirting everywhere, and they, you know, struggle to help her. You know, she's had some sort of fit or something. They bandage her up as best as they can and carry her back to her little cottage, where she lives out the rest of her days as a known witch. She's shunned. Children from nearby villages will go up and touch the threshold of her door for a bet. Sometimes they'll throw stones through her top window. It can be pretty mean, kids, sometimes, can't they? The years roll by and she gets older and older. She cannot spend any of the gold until she passes away, and then various long-distant relatives and gatherers, financial vultures, gather and go through her house and clear it out, getting rid of all her stuff, getting ready for the next occupant. And under her pillow, they find 2 bags filled with ancient gold coins. But as they hold them greedily in their hands, the coins turn to oak leaves and then to dust and drift away with the fairy wind. So a precautionary tale about fairies there. Don't believe Disney, and never accept cash bribes from badly dressed strangers. So, we're going to go on a little coracle ride now. We're going back to Taliesin, and we're going to drift across the Irish Sea into the lap of Manannan Maclear, the Irish sea god. And we're going to drift up to the Western Isles of Scotland and all the way up to Orkney. Now, in this part of the world, there's a lot of sea-based folklore, as you can imagine. Sort of one of the reasons why we've called this show Celtic Tides. There's a lot of mermaids and sea witches and sirens luring sailors to their doom, and there's a lot of Selkies. Now, one of the reasons I really love folklore, or we both do, is you get this idea a lot of the time. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, but you get a lot of people in today's age that sort of have this idea that myth and folklore, you know, it's like entertainment for the pre-Netflix age, or maybe just precautionary tales for children, or maybe sort of bad science for people that didn't understand things. I personally, I don't think any of that is true. I think this is a way of just delivering, I guess, a kind of therapy in days outside of organised religion, or before Freud or Jung. You know, there's a lot of deep wisdom in a lot of these stories, I feel, that kind of puts any personal experience we have on in a bigger story, on mythic ground, that sort of helps give it meaning and helps us navigate it. So a story about Selkies now, which are shape-shifting seal people that sing beautiful songs.
I love the Selkie stories personally. They really attracted me and drew me in. And this one in particular, because it resonated with me quite deeply with some past experiences that I've had, and I'm sure that a lot of us have been through. A lot of these stories are metaphorical, I think, and there's a lot of sort of metaphors deep in them that you could, a bit like songwriting. For me as a songwriter, I find those metaphors in song. And I think the beautiful thing about songwriting is that you can choose any meaning. So a song I write might mean something different to you or to someone else. And that's the same thing with these stories, that there's always lots of different meanings, and you can bring your own meaning away from them. But the Selkie stories themselves, this one in particular is my favourite one, because it's kind of a metaphor, well, I think it is, for I'm sure we've all been there, especially as many of the females in the audience, where you feel like you're maybe not in the right relationship, and you sacrifice a little bit of yourself to make somebody else happy. And, you know, we give ourselves we're like, oh no, but it's fine, I can sacrifice that part of myself because I'm happy in this side of things. And actually, I don't think we should ever sacrifice a part of ourselves. I think we should just, you know, be our raw, beautiful, weird selves. And yeah, if you can be with that with somebody else, and then let's keep it that way. But this story, I think, is a sort of example of feeling a bit trapped and a bit sort of lost in a relationship. And it's called The Fisherman and the Selkie Bride. So I'm going to sing a little song to start you off. Sing a song of sisters under the moonlight, under the big sky, at the edge of the island. Oh, dancing with no clothes on, singing their sweet song, skin almost human, hair made of silver and gold, and the ocean gives them freedom every full moon. They sing their songs out at shore and sing out, oh, 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 oh. We are the other ones from the unseen world. Sing out, oh, oh, oh. We are the other ones from the unseen world.
There was once a fisherman. He lived alone. His mum and dad had died long time ago, and left him this little hut in Orkney on the edge of the sea. And he lived there, and he lived a very solitary life. He liked it that way, you know. All his friends, or half friends, they got married and had kids long ago and left him alone. But he was happy with that life, in a way. He would catch some fish, and a couple of times a week he would take some bits to the nearest village somewhere along the shore, and he would sell in exchange for some other little bits and pieces. And he made his life this way. But he was lonely, you know. It was a solitary life. And he did long for companionship sometimes. Now one evening, he was fishing out late, far away, far beyond his usual fishing grounds. He had just been led there following the signs and signals in the sea, like fishermen do. Despite this, it was a very, very bad fishing day. He had just caught a few little fish. And he was making his way back to shore under the moonlight. And he moored up his little boat in a little bay that he didn't use that often, actually. And he was walking back along the grey pebble beach underneath the moonlight, across a bay far away from any village or any other habitation. And he didn't come this way a lot. And there he stopped, dead in his tracks. He saw something there in the moonlight on the beach. It was people dancing in sort of reels on the beach, dancing and singing. And they were beautiful, and they were naked, singing this beautiful song. And as he watched out to sea under the moonlight, from the slate grey waves from beneath them came seals out of the sea, and they came ashore and stood up and peeled off their skins like cloaks and let them drop to the floor. And underneath was human forms, some women, some men, all beautiful with long slate grey hair. And they would take their skins, bundle them up and put them on the grey rocks, and join the other dancers on the beach and sing the most beautiful songs. And this fisherman, he was mesmerised. He had never seen any such thing. Now he knew some of the folklore, you know, everyone did in this part of the world, and he knew they were Selkies, shape-shifting seal people, and he knew they couldn't change without their skins. And as he watched, transfixed, he saw there was one Selkie woman more beautiful than all the rest. And something moved inside him. Something dark and longing. He knew he must have her. He fell deeply in love with her. Then something changed in the air. The wind hadn't changed. He knew it was not his sense. He knew it wasn't his smell. Maybe they could sense his thoughts. But those Selkies, they suddenly became alarmed and looked around in fear, and then gradually they hurriedly gathered their skins from the rocks and slipped, boom, 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 one after the other, back beneath the slate grey waves and away. All bar one. The very female that fisherman had his eye on. She was worrying, wondering frantically, looking around for her skin, and she could not find it. Hello, thought the fisherman, and some dark thought moved within him, and just as he thought this, boom, something bumped up against his foot, carried in the surf. It nudged up against his foot. It looked like a oilskin jacket, but he knew what it was. It was a seal skin. Now, we all know the right thing to do at this moment. Why do we do it? In this moment, that fisherman put it under his jacket, under his sea coat, and hurriedly, quickly, by dark, hidden paths on cliffways that only he knew, went back to his hut, the other side of the bay, and deposited that sealskin behind the chimney place. And then thought quickly. He had a couple of fish that he had caught today, a couple of little fish. He had a wee dram of whiskey. He had another sea coat that he put under his arm. And then he hurriedly went back down with a light, back down to the beach. And to his almost surprise and astonishment, that Selkie woman was still sat there, crying sorrowfully, pitifully on a rock at the edge of the sea. Now, this was a difficult kind of strange courtship ritual that this fisherman had to enact. Now, he started off with the little fish that he had. He was like, go on, it's okay, and handed these little fish to that Selkie. She was not particularly gainly. She eyed him suspiciously for a while, and then, oh no, they just disappeared down. I got it, and another. Good. That had gained trust slightly, and he poured a little cup of whiskey. It's okay. Had a bit himself and passed her some, and yeah, that was good. That warmed her up. And then he held out his coat. She shrunk away a bit, and then just put it over her shoulders. And then that seal woman, she spoke as if her mouth hadn't formed human speech for many years. She said in an old broken dialect of Scottish, "I've lost my skin. I cannot find it. Someone's taken it. Will you help me find it?" And he said, "Shh, the shit." He said, We'll look tomorrow. Come back. My house is just over there. It's warm. I have food. Yeah, food." She went back and, well, one thing led to another. Sometimes things move very, very quickly in fairy tales, right? They had 3 children together and fell in love. Well, he fell in love with her, desperately, uncontrollably in love with her. He would do anything for her, and to his credit, he was devoted. He went out every day to fish to make sure those 3 little kids, those 2 twin girls with slate grey eyes and grey hair, and that little boy, the youngest, that beautiful little boy with his speckled little eyes, were well fed, right? He would do anything for them. And the seal wife, she loved him too, in a way. But she loved her children utterly. And that fisherman, he was happy. He knew happiness like he had never known before. And sometimes, not often, because they were both solitary people and so were the children, sometimes they would go to the pub, several miles along the shoreline, little fisherman's pub. And sometimes she would just break into song. The most beautiful, sad song in a language that no one knew, long forgotten dialect, and the whole pub just went quiet, just gazed at her in longing, and that fisherman's heart swelled with pride, knowing that she was his, and his alone. But he was never happiest and proudest when she would sing just alone, just for him and the kids in their little hut by the sea, by the fire. But there was always a sadness to it. And sometimes she would just gaze out to sea, sadly, and she would sing alone. And sometimes it was said in the village that the villagers would see her conversing in urgent, hushed tones with a seal that would then slip beneath the waves. Now, years passed, and those kids started to grow up. In fact, the fishermen used to take the two girls out fishing on fishing expeditions and leave the little boy at home. He wasn't quite old enough yet. And one of these days, the fishermen and the two girls, they were out fishing. And that Selkie bride, she's just looking out of the window and seeing some seals play on the rocks. And she's just overcome with longing for the life she used to live. And tears are rolling down her face, and that little cherubic little jug of joy of a child just says, "Mummy, what's wrong?" And for some reason, for the first time ever, she says the truth, you know. She says, "My boy, I'm a seal. My place is not on land. I belong out there with those seals you see out on the rock there. I belong out there. But I can never return home because someone has taken my skin, or I've lost my skin, but I don't have my skin anymore, and without it I cannot ever go home." And some little note of understanding just sounds in that little boy's face, and he just sort of scrabbles up behind a chimney and scrambles up there to some little hiding place he's found that only he feels knows about, and pulls out this little chest and waddles up to his mum and opens it up, and there inside is that seal skin. And a lot of emotions pass through that woman's mind right there. There's relief, there's joy, there's surprise, there's confusion, and then there's anger. Quite a lot of anger. Now, there's many different versions of the end of this story, and maybe you know a different one yourself. Maybe you're already composing one in your head, and that's all valid, and it all exists in this room right now. But in this version, she takes that skin and she runs. She runs as fast as her human legs will carry her, all the way down to the sea. Now, just with almost perfect timing, just then her husband is getting into the bay just below his hut with her two daughters, and he gets into the house and he sees this trail of straw, and he realizes exactly what's happened, and he shakes his little boy and he's like, "Where's mummy? Where's mummy?" "She's gone home, Daddy," he says, and he runs, everything just tumbling through his head, thinking, what am I going to say? What can I say? How can I make this right? How can I make this right? And he gets there just as she's standing with her feet being lapped by the sea, with her skin in her hand, and he says, wait, don't go." And she turns around and she just looks at him, a look tinged with so many things. And she says, "Look after our kids." She puts that skin on, and beneath the waves she goes, and there out to sea, there's shapes in the sea. It looks like rocks, but it's not. It's a whole battalion, a whole army of seals, of Selkies. They're singing, they're calling her back beneath the waves, and she goes and rejoins them, and they sing a song, and they return, and he never sees that Selkie again. And you know, seals always gave him a wide berth after that. But you know something else? His nets were always full of fish. His kids and him never went hungry. And those kids, they were blessed children. They would walk along the sea, and sometimes seals would swim along next to them. Sometimes treasures would plop up from the waves and just wash out onto the silver sand in front of them. Sometimes a coin from a shipwreck, or maybe a message in a bottle from a far-off place, a promise of adventure. But they were always well looked after. And years later, that fisherman, he died, and they lived, the three of them together, and grew old there. They kept themselves to themselves, but they were always known as the seal people, and sometimes people would go to them for advice, maybe on the movements of the sea or the weather. They were sort of like a seal shipping forecast. Until eventually they vanished. And the folklore says they too joined their mum beneath the sea. So that is the story of the Selkie bride. Thank you.
Sailors on for sailors out in the deep night. They saw that sweet sight, nothing but delight. When you fall in love, it's really a desperate thing. He took her skin and gave her a wedding ring. Then the ocean became a locked door, and every full moon she'd hear her sisters out from shore singing out, we are the lucky ones. Sister, come join our song. We sing out, you belong to the sea. His salty tears won't set you free.
Beautiful.
Well, that's probably about all we've got time for tonight.
Yes. Thank you
very
so much for
guys.
coming down. This is
Yeah.
our second show. We really appreciate you coming out, taking a punt on something that you maybe didn't know what to expect, and we really appreciate it. Massive round of applause for Joe and Gary for looking after us tonight.
Please come back.
Oh, we'd love to come
If you've
back.
enjoyed any of these stories and don't want them to die, then tell them to someone you know.